Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our more than 500 participants tuning in from around the world. I'm Kate Jansen, editor of Speculum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first ever Speculum webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Medieval Academy of America for hosting this event. And special thanks go to Lisa Fagan-Davis, Executive Director, along with Renata Blumenfeld-Kosinski, President, who greenlighted this event. Thanks also to Chris Cole, our behind-the-scenes IT specialist, who is running the show today. This webinar was designed to bring scholars from around the world together to showcase their papers published in the January 2021 themed issue of Speculum, about which I'd like to say an introductory word about how it came together. Late last spring, in the midst of pandemic despair, I was looking over the articles that we already had in the pipeline, and a cluster of them caught my attention because their topics spoke to both medieval and contemporary concerns about disasters, pandemics, mortality rates, and even healing. Thus was the January 2021 themed issue born. It was curated from our pool of accepted articles rather than emerging from a special call for papers. In the event, this webinar is meant to function much like a book launch to preview and celebrate some of the latest exciting scholarship in the field of medieval studies, even as we acknowledge that we are doing so in the midst of even more turbulent and challenging times than last year. The parallels to the 14th century, a period of food insecurity, an uncontrolled pandemic, institutionalized structural inequalities, political instability, and the fracturing of venerable institutions spring perhaps too readily to mind. But this is also the very same period that provides the fertile context for some of today's stimulating papers, to return to the happier subject of the articles that are being showcased in our webinar. So let us proceed, and we will do so as follows. Our 5 panelists will speak in the order their papers appear in the January issue of Speculum. I will introduce each in turn, and they will each speak for 10 minutes or so. We'll have all of our panelists preview their papers before we turn to the discussion session, which I will moderate through the Q&A function of Zoom. So please enter your questions there, and you can begin entering your questions at any time. So now to the main event. And so as not to take away any time from our panelists and from the discussion, my introductions will be brief. First, let me introduce you to Shannon Gayk, who is Associate Professor of English at Indiana University. She is the author of Image, Text, and Religious Reform in 15th Century England. And she is completing a book on medieval religious literature and the environmental imagination. Her presentation today draws on that new work and is entitled Apocalyptic Ecologies, Eschatology, the Ethics of Care, and the 15 Signs of Doom in Early England. Professor Gayk.
Okay, this will take me just a minute. Okay, so hopefully you all can see the PowerPoint here and hear me as well. Over a decade ago, when I was in York for the summer, I found myself in one of the city's many parish churches, All Saints North Street, which happens to have some of the best preserved medieval stained glass in England. Most of its windows are familiar scenes. In one, Anne teaches the Virgin to read. Another depicts the corporal works of mercy, people caring for the sick, the imprisoned, and the dying. But my gaze soon landed on a window that was less immediately legible. It was wilder and more abstract. Many of its frames contained trees, water, and fire. One had savage fish rising from an unsettled sea. Others I couldn't make heads or tails of. At that point, I had never seen anything quite like it. And I've been thinking about that window ever since. As it turns out, though, the window's subject, the 15 Signs of the Doom, is far more common than I then knew. It appears in hundreds of medieval text and images, where it represents the world's death as a process akin to what we would now call ecological collapse. What I'm hoping to do today is to give you a bird's eye view of this tradition, a sense of my eco-critical approach to it, and to offer a few thoughts about why I think it matters. My article dives much more deeply into the nitty-gritty of its development, its different branches, and its larger concerns than I will here. Instead, I want to consider how the 15 signs foster reflection on the value of imagining the death of the world. So let's begin with what exactly this motif is. In short, the 15 Signs of Doomsday is an apocryphal legend that depicts wondrous events that herald the Last Judgment. The specifics of its development remain rather murky, but it seems to derive from biblical and apocryphal traditions. It first appears in the early Middle Ages, probably in an insular context, as short lists of 6 or 7 signs, and it expands to the full 15 sign tradition by the mid-11th century. From there, versions proliferate in Latin and many vernacular languages well into the Renaissance. The motif almost always appears as a straightforward catalog of catastrophes. This is the sequence that's depicted in the window at York. Notice how humans don't really enter the picture until the later signs. That's because the motif tells a story for humans that is not exclusively or even primarily about humans. Instead, it trains the gaze on the non-human world, focusing on how the final days will affect rocks and water and trees and animals. Some of the motif's environmental catastrophes could be ripped from today's headlines. Ocean levels rise, fires scorch the earth, the ground is shaken by quakes, cities crumble, and human communities break down as people can no longer understand or communicate with each other. Other versions of the tradition predict weirder phenomena. Trees and grass bleed, water burns, fish rise out of the sea and roar, terrified birds huddle in treetops, and stones fight. Taken together, these disquieting phenomena constitute what I call apocalyptic ecologies. By this phrase, I simply mean the unraveling of environmental and social networks in the Earth's final days, the process by which the world falls apart. The 15 Signs vision of the future is undeniably a dark one. Apocalyptic ecologies are not a future into which we progress, but rather one into which we spiral. Yet in their description of the process of ecological collapse, I see the signs functioning as a kind of ars moriendi for a wounded and dying world. They create a sense of ethical urgency by anatomizing the world's inevitable breakdown, cataloging its horrors. And they do so, I argue, not only to generate fear as we might expect, but also to encourage the work of care. The 15 signs thus suggest how one might tell a story about ecological impermanence that both mourns inevitable losses and acknowledges that imagining dark futures, even if we can't fully comprehend their scale or decipher their portents, can spur greater compassion in the present. But how do we get from imagining or witnessing signs of ecological collapse to compassionate action in the world? This is not an easy question then or now, but it's at the heart of my reading of this tradition. And so in the rest of my time today, I want to suggest the motif invites its readers to translate contemplation into action by first prompting sustained attention to non-human suffering, and second, by shifting that gaze to other, more immediately proximate suffering bodies. As I've already noted, whether it appears in a sermon, a longer devotional work, or a lyric, the 15 signs almost always circulate as an enumerated list. On the first day, the seas rise. On the second day, they fall, and so on. And here is an example of one of the lyrics that represents this list in a very straightforward way. These lists communicate the nearly unthinkable scale of the final catastrophe through imagery, repetition, and accretion. They pile up horrors, sometimes pausing to add adjectives to emphasize the terrors of these final days. And in so doing, they depict wonders to be imagined, to be looked at, that demand apprehension, but remain somewhat opaque and resistant to full comprehension. We are never told why these things will happen, just that they will, and that we should be paying attention. Likewise, the signs almost never explicitly moralize the portents they describe. They don't treat them as symbols. They don't even reach for typologies. Instead, they highlight the inscrutability of the world's suffering. To give just one example of this, the 14th century poem, The Prick of Conscience, notes that the roaring of the fish on the fourth day will sound hideous to human ears, but what it signifies, no human may know, only God. The signs insist that human beings will perceive the world's pain, but that its meaning will remain beyond their kin. But if the motif resists directly moralizing these catastrophes, if it insists both on the power of the imagination and on partial knowledge, if it situates human beings largely outside of the scenes, what type of response does it want from its audience? For many medieval thinkers, the point of imagining apocalypse was to encourage relinquishment. Earthly ruin, earthly catastrophe are the world's reminders not to love it, reminders to look beyond the mutability of the physical realm to the stability of the spiritual one. And yet, while renunciation of the material realm may be a dominant medieval response to the ephemerality of all creation, as I think the 15 signs can remind us, it is not the only response. After inviting their audience to witness the suffering of the non-human world, some treatments of the motif redirect the gaze to other suffering, wounded, dying bodies. In these treatments, rehearsal of the signs is followed by two additional apocalyptic motifs: the ostentatio vulnerum, Jesus' display of his wounds, and the corporal works of mercy. In the first, Jesus calls attention to his own suffering. His body, like the wounded world, is riven and bloody, a parallel that is drawn by several treatments of the motif. He asks the souls whether they cared for those suffering around them while alive. The linking concept here, of course, is that of the suffering body. From the dying non-human bodies that populate the 15 signs, to Jesus's wounded corpse, to the more ordinary bodies of the hungry, the naked, the sick, the homeless, the dying, the prisoner. When accompanying the 15 signs, a tradition that attends in such a sustained way to the physical deterioration of the non-human world, the injunction to care for the bodily needs of one's suffering neighbor takes on a new power and urgency. How do we prepare for the inevitable death of the world? This tradition answers, practice the work of care now. For what remains of the final days as matter, society, language, and even cognition deteriorate, are suffering and the need for compassionate engagement. Ultimately, of course, the model of care encouraged by the 15 signs is more anthropocentric than biocentric, more palliative than preventative. I'm not proposing that the 15 signs articulated a sense of human responsibility for the earth or its animals, or even expressed real desire to stall or prevent the future degradation of the physical world. Modern environmentalists often proclaim that there is no planet B. But for medieval Christians, the end of the world was not an end at all. Medieval providential thinking about the inevitable apocalypse was fundamentally optimistic, seeing the cataclysms of the last days as the death pangs that usher in a new heaven and a new earth. But while medieval Christians did not share our world's optimism about the ability of human ingenuity to engineer a way out of final destruction, sorry. And while medieval people may not share medieval optimism about a new earth that will follow the destruction of this one, as the 15 signs suggest, the practice of imagining our collective end, then as now, invites both meditation on the ephemerality of all things and reflection on how to live well in the time and the world that we still have. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon, for that wonderful peek at your work of eco-criticism and its chastening warnings to us all, I suppose. Now we move from visions of doom in late medieval England to the first plague pandemic in Europe. Michael McCormick is the Francis Golay Professor of Medieval History and chairs the university-wide Initiative for the Science of the Human Past at Harvard University. He has written prolifically, and among his monographs are the pluri-prize-winning Origins of the European Economy, and his most recent book, Charlemagne's Survey of the Holy Land, Wealth, Personnel, and Buildings of a Mediterranean Church Between Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Today, he'll be giving us a glimpse of his article entitled Gregory of Tours on 6th Century Plague and Other Epidemics. Mike.
Thank you, Kate. The written history of pre-modern Western Eurasia has recorded 4 major pandemics. 2 under the Romans, 1 at the end of antiquity, the beginning of the Middle Ages under Emperor Justinian, the first pandemic that is now robustly demonstrated to have been caused by bubonic plague, and of course the second bubonic plague pandemic that began with the Black Death in the 14th century. The Justinianic bubonic plague was demonstrated robustly from the ancient DNA of the pathogen in the skeletons of the victims in Bavaria from the middle of the 6th century in 2013 for the very first time. Eyewitnesses who participated in its arrival in the imperial capital in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, give extraordinary accounts of the mortalities in the city in early 542. According to the spotty written records and historians' reconstruction of the events, plague returned. Epidemics broke out again around the Roman and former Roman space between 18 and 35 times between 541 and about 750. What kind of effects did this pandemic that lasted not 12 months, as our own has done so far, but 200 years? What kind of effects did it have? And opinions differ. Older scholarship almost universally minimized its impact. More recently, scholars have felt differently, and opinions continue to vary. How can we determine what happened and what effect it had, where and when? This is one of the tasks that the new Max Planck Harvard Research Center for Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean has set itself. This is a collaboration between the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, and the Initiative for the Science of the Human Past at Harvard. We are investigating this question using history, philology, and digital humanities, archaeology, and archaeogenetics. You can get a first sense of the results of the digital humanities and philology from the geodatabase of written reports of epidemics, which summarizes the work of previous scholars and which you can access on our digital atlas, Roman Medieval Civilization, which is about to morph to a much more powerful and fun platform, but it'll have the same URL, so you'll be able to find it there. The archaeological features have been a very important next step. It was thought that there were no mass burials from antiquity, so how could there have been mass deaths? In fact, we now have many mass burials, as I'll show you in a second. Multiple burials and emergency burials have also been revealed to be bearers of the pathogen of Yersinia pestis. In 2015 and 2016, I published the first archaeological inventory of mass burials, more than 5 or more people in the same grave, from the period between the 4th and the 8th centuries. As you can see, they are documented around the Roman Empire and beyond, and they do seem to peak in the 6th and 7th centuries. The etiologies, the causes of death, are not clear. In the overwhelming majority of cases, they are to be investigated. Here, however, you can see from the diamonds places in which we've already been able to identify the ancient DNA of Yersinia pestis in the remains of the victims. So I'm going to talk about history and philology mostly today, and I'm going to conclude with a little archaeogenetics. Early medieval epidemics are recorded in the written records. The written records are rich, but they are very uneven. There are huge gaps in the records that allow different interpretations. The early medieval texts themselves in Greek and Latin are characterized by languages that are in complete flux and evolution in part because of the closing of the school system and many other matters. So they are challenging linguistically. You have to do very close philological linguistic analysis to accurately assess their meaning. I'm going to focus today on Gregory of Tours, Bishop of Tours, born at Clermont in south central France in around 538, and who was Bishop of Tours for 20 years in the second half of the 6th century. Gregory is the most important historian writing in Latin in the 6th century. There's 1,100 pages of works that have survived, about half of histories and half of biographies of saints. That's my copy there. You can see it's pretty big, and you can see I've spent some time with it. Gregory of Tours is infused with the Bible. He is overcome, his work displays constantly his pastoral concerns, how God is active in history by visiting evils on the world to punish the sinners who live in it. The cultural and biographical and historical matrix of his work has been beautifully illuminated by scholars since the work of Goffert in 1988. These are only a few of those who've made the most important contributions to understanding Gregory and his cultural context. He talks a lot about plague. The yellow dots are places in which Gregory mentions a plague outbreak. The red triangles is our ancient DNA evidence of plague. Gregory is hard to understand. He is writing in late Latin. He is writing in a language which is undergoing linguistic flux. It is philologically very challenging to understand exactly what he's trying to say. And now, thanks to the work of the scholars I've just mentioned, particularly Murray, we know that he left his work mostly unfinished. So it was never revised, errors were never removed, sentences were never completed. Thus, close philological analysis is indispensable to understanding his testimony. Thank heavens, we have some magnificent work done from the 19th century forward, particularly the monument of descriptive philology by Max Bonnet, Le Latin de Grégoire de Tours, and we have the 21st century digital humanities tools that allow exhaustive study of the usage and words that Gregory displays. Here you see a table of all the occurrences of explicitly identified inguinal disease, diseases with lesions in the inguine, in the thighs, that is to say, buboes in the thighs. Most scholars accept this prima facie as evidence of bubonic plague. So here you can see, again, the places in which Gregory observes plague, reports plague in his histories and his hagiographies. There are 22 mentions of plague in the works of Gregory that refer to 6 different epidemic outbreaks in 22 different places. Gregory's information is robust, but it is geographically constrained. Look again at the map. Almost all of the places where Gregory knows of plague are within 400 kilometers of his birthplace in Clermont. That's 8 to 10 days travel. Almost all he knows about plagues, we can show and try to show in this article, come from personal contacts. In many cases, we can name the person who told him. Most of the places in which ancient DNA has irrefutably demonstrated plague outbreaks are lacking in Gregory's mentions of plague. He does not know, or if he knew, he does not mention that plague occurred there, underscoring the principle of historical and other scientific exploration that absence of written evidence is not absence of, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I want to conclude with a few words on the power of ancient DNA. The second robust demonstration that the pathogen in question during the Justinianic pandemic was bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, was led by Michael Feldman. We were fortunate to identify at Altenerding in Bavaria the ancient DNA of the pathogen that was well enough preserved to allow robust whole genome sequencing. This is really important because when you have a whole genome, when you have multiple whole genomes, you can establish the genealogy of the microbe as it moves from person to person, place to place, and wave to place, because mutations occur randomly and accumulate in the genome as it moves forward. And so we can use this rapidly mutating genomes to establish, to track how plague spread over time and space. Just as we can take a medieval manuscript and see from the errors that have accumulated in it from which copies it stems and to which copies it will give rise. Exactly the same method. In 2019, our team was able to identify 8 new sites with ancient DNA of plague in victims, 4 more in Bavaria, 2 new sites in France, and 1 each in Spain and Britain. They are small villages, 8 small villages and 2 cities, most of them separated by outside of Bavaria by more than 1,000 kilometers from each other. And under the leadership of Marcel Keller, our lead author in this study, we were able to establish the phylogeny of these genomes of plague. And you see it down on the bottom. It's just like one of our manuscript stemmas, except it's sideways. And what's really exciting here is that by establishing the phylogenetic distance from the root and the relations of individual genomes to other genomes, we can begin to associate particular victims' pathogen with particular outbreaks of the epidemic. Most exciting of all, in Eastern Britain, where I did not personally think there was evidence that plague had reached, the DNA showed the closest affinity to the form of the pathogen at the very outbreak of the disease in 541, 543 in Egypt or Alexandria. This suggests that this particular infection of plague was brought by the rats of plague. Plague is a disease that's endemic to rodents and only spills over into humans in a secondary fashion, that a ship or multiple ships must have traveled almost directly from Alexandria or Constantinople to Eastern Britain in around 541, 543. That is a completely amazing result. And we are just at the beginning of this extraordinary investigation. As more texts are identified, as each text will hopefully be subjected to the kind of detailed philological scrutiny that I've tried to prepare for Gregory of Tours, and as the archaeological and genetic evidence begins to map in more fully this very rich but uneven picture of the Great Plague of Justinian, the pandemic from 541 to about 750. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, so thank you, Mike, for that lively and stimulating introduction to your article, which models how humanistic and scientific inquiry can work together hand in glove to shed new light on old sources. Now we'll hear from Hannah Barker, who is an assistant professor of medieval history at Arizona State University. She studies connections between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean during the late medieval period, especially the trade in slaves to Genoa, Venice, and the Mamluk Kingdom. Her first book, That Most Precious Merchandise, The Mediterranean Trade in Black Sea Slaves, 1260 to 1500, was published last year and received the Paul E. Lovejoy Prize from the Journal of Global Slavery. Today, she'll be previewing her Speculum article, Laying the Corpses to Rest, Grain, Embargoes, and Yersinia pestis in the Black Sea, 1346 to 1348. Professor Barker.
So we're going to move from the first pandemic to the second pandemic. Most discussions of the Black Death outbreak of the mid-14th century start with Gabriele de Musi's description of the siege of Caffa. According to Musi, the first Europeans to become infected were Genoese colonists besieged by a Tatar army in Caffa, a port city on the Crimean Peninsula. After the siege had gone on for almost 3 years, a disease began to spread in the Tatar army. Soon it was killing thousands of soldiers per day. The Tatars decided to lift the siege, but first they catapulted the corpses of their own dead soldiers into Caffa in hopes that the quote-unquote intolerable stench would kill the defenders. The Caffans threw the corpses into the sea, but their air and water were polluted by the disease. They fled the city in ships, carrying the plague with them into the Mediterranean. So on the basis of this narrative, scholars have attributed the early spread of the Black Death to the siege of Caffa and have often interpreted it as an act of biological warfare by the Tatars. There are 2 problems with this. First, Musi's narrative doesn't make biological sense. We know that plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, as we've already heard, that it normally lives in rodents. And we know that human outbreaks normally occur when the bacteria move from wild to commensal rodents, which are the ones that live with human beings and eat their food. There are various estimates of how long it takes for Yersinia pestis to spread from the first commensal rodent in a certain population via its fleas to a noticeable number of human beings. And these estimates range anywhere from between 5 to 35 weeks, depending on the model. Once established in humans, Yersinia pestis can also pass directly among them through coughing. This version of transmission is called pneumonic transmission. The important thing, though, is that plague is normally not transmitted from human to human through dead bodies. There's a second problem with Musi's narrative, which is a historical one. Musi was a notary, so we know from the dating clauses on his documents that he stayed in Piacenza during the years leading up to the Black Death outbreak. He was nowhere near Caffa. So to check his account, it would be nice to have a text that was written by someone who was in Caffa at the beginning of the plague outbreak. This isn't as difficult as it sounds. There were lots of people who lived in the Black Sea during this time, and they wrote letters, diplomatic reports, legal documents, and chronicles that have survived. In fact, in February or March 1347, the residents of Caffa themselves sent a petition to Genoa. They explained that they had made peace with the Tatars after a long siege, but Caffa was in danger because the Tatars watch for nothing except precisely that the expenses run short and the place be stripped of soldiers, especially because they expect an endless plague of death, which laid low endless soldiers, and they were consumed in such a way that few men remain. This petition is the earliest direct reference to the Black Death in a European source. It shows that the people of Caffa were aware of a disease outbreak in the area, that it had not affected them during the Tatar siege, but that they expected it to affect them soon after the siege had been lifted. Byzantine observers were also well placed to describe the spread of plague in the Black Sea, and they also cast doubt on Musi's narrative. John VI Cantacuzene, who was the reigning emperor during the Black Death, wrote about an invading plague starting first from the Hyperborean Scythians. The chronicler Nicephorus Gregory described it as starting from Scythia and Meotis and the mouth of the Tanis. References to Scythia imply the steppe north of the Black Sea, which was the territory of the Golden Horde at this time, the Tatar state. The Meotidian marshes were located in the delta of the Tanis River, which is now called the Don, where it flows into the Sea of Azov. This was the location of Tana, the Golden Horde's most important port, and home to a large community of Venetian merchants. Here's a map of the Golden Horde just to explain what we're talking about here. So this means that we need to check Venetian sources to look at Tanna, as well as Genoese ones about Caffa, for information on the early spread of the plague. I give details in my article about the Genoese and Venetian presence in Caffa and Tanna, but the gist is that in the 1340s, Genoa and Venice were competing for hegemony over trade in the Black Sea. The Khans of the Golden Horde had granted Genoa the right to govern Caffa directly as a colony, but they only permitted Venetians to settle in Tanna and not to govern it. Both cities exported grain, local goods like fur and slaves, and luxury goods like silk and jewels that had been transported long distances through the Silk Road network. The presence of grain should get our attention because of the well-established links between grain shipment and plague transmission in both medieval and modern contexts. Again, I give more details in the article, but grain from the Black Sea was an important part of the food supply for the urban populations of Constantinople, as well as Genoa and Venice. Within the Black Sea, grain was usually shipped from north to south, and it took up to 4 weeks to reach Constantinople. The voyage from the Black Sea to Genoa or Venice took at least 6 months. Since Yersinia pestis had reached Crimea by October or November 1346, it should have traveled with infected rats and fleas accompanying the grain shipments reaching Constantinople in early September and Italy in October or November. Human outbreaks should have been recorded 5 to 35 weeks later, between October 1346 and May 1347 for Constantinople, and between November 1346 and June 1347 in Genoa and Venice. That's not what happened. Plague was recorded in Constantinople in September 1347. Genoa was affected in November or December 1347, which is 6 to 12 months later than what we might expect. Venice was affected in March 1348, which is 8 to 15 months later than what we would expect. In other words, Yersinia pestis was actually really slow to cross the Black Sea. This was because the Black Sea grain trade wasn't operating normally during these years. Instead, Genoa and Venice were at war with the Golden Horde, Caffa was besieged, and all the parties involved had declared trade embargoes. So I get into the politics in the article, but in essence, the grain harvests of 1345 and 1346 weren't exported because Tatar merchants wouldn't sell it to Italians and Italian merchants wouldn't buy it from them. In other words, Musi's narrative got Caffa's role in the plague transmission backwards. The siege and the embargoes that were associated with it delayed the spread of plague rather than accelerating it. It's important to note that many people visited the major cities of the Golden Horde and crossed the Black Sea in 1346, when there was already plague spreading on the north coast. But in traveling to the south, they didn't bring plague with them. These people included messengers, Genoese and Venetian ambassadors trying to negotiate peace, Venetian prisoners who were released from the capital at Nusaray, and there was at least one Mamluk merchant who traveled from Crimea to Aleppo, where he described the beginning of the Crimean plague outbreak in detail to the Mamluk chronicler Ibn al-Wardi, but he didn't bring plague with him even though he had witnessed the outbreak. What didn't cross the Black Sea from north to south in 1346 was grain. The sources are very vocal about this because it caused food shortages in Constantinople and in Venice. It was at the end of 1346 that the Tatars finally raised their siege and made peace with Genoa and lifted the embargo. Peace with Venice took a little bit longer, but because of the food shortages, the Venetian Senate authorized its galleys to sail to Tanna anyway, for the first time since 1343, but only to buy grain. And they specified that if no grain was available, then the ships had to come back empty. They couldn't take any other kinds of goods except grain. It was during this time, about 6 months after the siege of Caffa, that Yersinia pestis crossed the Black Sea. It appeared in Constantinople and Trebizond at about the same time in late August or early September. This falls within the transmission estimates if the first grain had left Caffa and Tanna in July, which is reasonable. What's interesting is that as it spread onward into the Mediterranean, Yersinia pestis moved differently through Genoese and Venetian networks. In the Genoese network, plague revealed itself quickly. The estimate suggests that the ship leaving Kaffa in August with grain from the 1347 harvest was likely to reach the Tyrrhenian Sea in late September or early October. According to the Sicilian chronicler Michele de Piazza, it was in October that 12 Genoese galleys returning from the Black Sea delivered plague to Messina. As he described, plague began to spread immediately. If anyone so much as spoke with one of the Genoese, he was infected with the deadly illness and could not avoid death. Breath spread the infection among those speaking together. As the Genoese galleys continued north, other observers also described contagion spreading immediately through breath, touch, or even sight, in a way that evokes our model of pneumonic transmission. In the Venetian shipping network, on the other hand, plague revealed itself slowly. A ship leaving Tanna in August should have reached Venice in September or October, but there's no recorded outbreak until January in Ragusa, which is marked on the map, and March in Venice, which is about 16 to 20 weeks later. This fits better with patterns of plague transmission via rats and fleas rather than the pneumonic transmission. So to conclude, the explanation usually given for the transmission of plague to Western Europe is based on a single text by a notary from Piacenza with no direct knowledge of events in the Black Sea. When we emphasize texts written by people who lived in the Black Sea, a different story emerges. The siege of Kaffa was just one episode in a long struggle over trade in the Black Sea. In the mid-1340s, trade embargoes were used as a part of this struggle. It was only when the embargoes were lifted and the shipment of the 1347 grain harvest began that the Black Death began to move across the Black Sea. The plague spread was definitely not a matter of bioterrorism during the siege of Kaffa. Instead, it was an unintended consequence of peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for that excellent trailer of your article, which certainly gives us a new perspective on the timing of the transmission of plague, of the bubonic plague to Western Europe. Now we turn to Daniel Curtis, an associate professor in the history department at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He is the lead on a 5-year project funded by the Dutch Research Council entitled Positively Shocking: The Redistributive Impact of Mass Mortality Through Epidemic Diseases and Violent Conflict in Early Modern Northwest Europe. He has also just published a co-authored book entitled Disasters and History: The Vulnerability and Resilience of Past Societies, which you all will be happy to learn is open access at Cambridge University Press. He will be speaking to us on his article entitled From One Mortality Regime to Another, ? Mortality Crises in Late Medieval Haarlem, Holland, in Perspective. Dr. Curtis.
Okay, thanks. Hello. So the point of departure for the paper that appears in Speculum is this notion of two mortality regimes existing in pre-industrial Europe: a late medieval regime characterized by frequent virulent mortality crises caused by epidemics and famines, which over time gives way to a early modern regime of less frequent and more moderate mortality crises, and population developments generally driven by nuptiality and fertility. And this might make sense given two things which have been suggested. First of all, the idea that diseases such as plague by the 15th or 16th century become more focused diseases, perhaps more urban phenomenon. It's been at least argued. But also in certain parts of Northwestern Europe, we see a slow escape from famine-related mortality. However, In the paper, I also identify a number of gaps in our knowledge about medieval mortality. First of all, too much we have is still based on the situation in England. We still have very little employment of serial mortality data. We have not much in the way of serial data linking medieval and early modern periods, and certainly nothing using the same standardizable source. You know, it's quite strange to me that we can argue for two distinct mortality regimes, but have no source to link the two periods. Most of the mortality evidence that we see comes from selective or unrepresentative environments, such as ecclesiastical institutions, or from unrepresentative social groups, such as elites, landlords, creditors, and so on. And frequently we also find that most mortality evidence is just a sample of adult men. That being the case, I was happy to discover this source in the Haarlem archive. It's the Klok en Graf register for St. Bavo Church in Haarlem, which is essentially a register of all the bells tolled and all the graves dug for this particular church across a large portion of the late Middle Ages. And the nice thing is that I'm able to compare this also with what is effectively the same source for the 17th century. So it gives a long run of data. It's a large database, as you can see. And also another nice thing about this source is that women are present and are not structurally under-recorded. So men and women are equally recorded within the source. The paper also addresses a number of, let's say, more localized debates or Holland-centric debates, especially this idea of Holland in the late Middle Ages having a particularly low mortality regime. The idea that perhaps plague prior to 1550 was localized and endemic, perhaps dying out before that date. And also a recent idea that towns in late medieval Holland were more sanitary and hygienic than those found in the early modern period. That's quite an interesting argument that's recently been made. So just going to move this. So as I suggested, some of the most interesting findings or data from the paper, I think, is connected to the sex disaggregated mortality figures. And what I find within the paper is basically that sex ratios in mortality are lower during mortality crises than normal years. That is to say, more women than men tend to die during mortality crises when compared to normal years. And this is a finding that I've also seen elsewhere in other publications that I've recently been involved with. So it's a finding that I've also seen for the 17th century, using the burial records within the 17th century Low Countries. Also, it's a finding that I had with work together with a colleague, Joris Roosen, for the county of Hainaut in southern Belgium in the Middle Ages. So I keep finding this this result. And it's interesting because it goes against theorized expectations on perhaps two grounds. First, the idea of a female mortality advantage during famines, often driven by physiological factors, it's been suggested. But also, modern laboratory evidence tends to suggest that women have a stronger resistance to most pathogens that cause diseases, with a few exceptions such as malaria and so on. So why is this data really going against theorized expectations? In the paper, I consider a number of different potential factors. But I think the one that I find the most convincing so far is this notion of gender-based inequalities in caregiving tasks, both familial and commercial, so working in other people's households for money, which leads in turn to inequalities in exposure to vectors and points of contagion. That is to say, natural female advantages are being lost through social inequalities, you could say. In terms of the overall mortality trends from the paper, this is a graph of what is going on. The first half of the 15th century is very different to that of the second half. The first half you have fewer spikes, but more substantial, you could say. From the later point of the 15th century, early 16th century, you see much more spikes, smaller ones, and I believe that they are more causally connected to declining living standards, so there are more diseases of hardship. Why do I say this? Well, this is the proportion of people buried in St. Barbara Church that receive the bells. So the bells are a kind of marker of social status. Not everybody that gets buried in the church receives the bells because they cost money. And you can see from around 1470s, 1480, that there is a real decline in the amount of people that receive or are able to pay for these bells. This is the data placed over the very long term, so including also the early modern data. As I said, this is a kind of standardized source. In the paper, there are many more nuances to what I'm saying, but I think the main thing that you can take here is essentially that the late medieval spikes, the deviations from trend, were much more substantial than those seen in the 17th century. I think this is quite an important finding in the sense that it interacts with graphs such as this. So we've seen a lot of these kind of graphs in recent times in quite prestigious science journals, which suggest changing mortality activity over time, but that's not really the case. All these kinds of graphs show by digitizing Bireben is that the early modern period had more sources than that of the late Middle Ages. And I think that's why it's important to have these kinds of serial standardizable runs of mortality information. So basically in the article, I have three main findings. One, mortality activity not really the same across the whole of the late Middle Ages. However, the 15th century epidemics do appear to be more severe than in the 17th century. I provide a bit more empirical support to arguments suggesting that pre-industrial epidemics tend to more significantly affect women than men. And my evidence also runs counter to this recent literature emphasizing sanitary and hygienic urban environments in late medieval Holland. Unless you're going to make the claim that hygiene and epidemics are not causally related, which you can also make. This is just as introduced, this is the new book that's come out, and this is some bits and pieces if you're curious to read a bit more. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel, for introducing us to your quantitative research and that amazingly complete database that you have been able to so usefully mine. Now, and finally, from doom, disease, and death, we turn to our final speaker to give us the healing balm of music. Renata Pieragostini is currently a visiting scholar in the musicology department at Indiana University. Her research, published in Early Music History, Music and Letters, Plainsong and Medieval Music, and Scriptorium, focuses on the relation between music, prophetic literature, and medical astrology, and the role of religious orders in musical exchanges between England and Italy. She's currently working on a book on ideas about music in the writings of Florence's Chancellor Coluccio Salutati. Today, she introduces her Speculum article, The Healing Power of Music, another question mark, documentary evidence from late 14th century Bologna. And in fact, coincidentally, she is zooming in from Bologna today. Dr. Pieragostini.
Thank you very much. So was music used as therapy in medieval practical medicine? Well, we know that the idea of the healing power of music has a long history, and in medieval Europe, it was often rehearsed by several commentators who derived it via Boethius, mostly from Pythagorean and Neoplatonic theories, according to which the relationship between body and soul was ruled by musical principles. And this explained the powerful effects that music can have on the mind and the body, including curative powers. And this was such an influential and pervasive idea in the medieval and early modern periods that we may think it also had practical applications in medicine. But the reality is that most formal writings on medicine, texts written by academic physicians in medieval Europe, do not devote much space to discussions of music and its curative effects. And also we have very little evidence of specific cases in which music was used in a therapeutic context. And that's why recent scholarship has questioned the real importance of music in practical medicine. So any new piece of evidence that helps answer this question is very valuable. And in my article, I present and discuss two new documents that offer precisely this type of evidence. And I have to say that this was a serendipitous find, because I was browsing an old edition of the official correspondence of one of the chancellors of Bologna, Pellegrino Zambeccari, and the correspondence was written on behalf of the city government between 1389 and 1399. And I came across two letters mentioning music and musicians. And I realized that these documents were very relevant not only to the history of musical practice, but also to the history of the relationship between medicine and music. So what are these documents about? The first is a sort of presentation letter for a musician who is not named, skilled in the arts of singing and storytelling, who is sent by the government to the home of the private citizen named Carolus, who appears to be an influential individual in the city. And this Carolus has a son who is seriously ill and unlikely to survive his illness. And his father is overwhelmed by grief. And so the officials of Bologna are worried for his health because they know that grief, especially immoderate grief, is a dangerous passion that can lead to illness. And they also fear that Carolus may lose his judgment and cease to be an example of moral behavior to other citizens as he has been until then. So they believe that music can cure him. And they recommend that this musician should perform music and songs and tell stories for Carolus to cure him, soothe his grief, and restore his psychic health. The second document is a permission to transit the territory controlled by Bologna, granted to a man named Sergio, who is an itinerant healer, an expert in dentistry, in curative herbs and remedies against poison. And he is also a performer of songs, a reciter of verses, and a storyteller. And he's also, interestingly, described as a teacher in this art. So the officials of the commune praise his musical skills, and this is very interesting, as an important part of his art as a healer, because they acknowledge that music is beneficial to the health of the mind and the body, because it helps achieve a state of joy and tranquility of mind, and this is fundamental to health. And since Sergio's services will be useful to the population under their control, they allow him to travel freely in and out of the city without payment of any taxes or tolls. So in the documents, I discuss each letter separately and in detail, but here I'm just going to mention the most important themes that emerge from both letters. So common to both documents is the idea that negative passions can cause illness. And this reflects what most medical writings said about the effects of the passions, accidents of the soul, on the mind and the body. And in both letters, listening to music and songs and stories is seen as beneficial for keeping the mind cheerful, counteracting the effects of negative passions, and in general, preventing illness. And this is something that physicians sometimes recommended in their writings. And this can be found in specific categories of writings, such as hygiene handbooks or treatises on the plague, and also treatises on melancholy. So in the article, I discuss how these two cases relate to this theoretical medical literature. But what's most remarkable here is that we see the notion of music as therapy put into practice, applied in everyday life. And so the two documents support the argument that the idea of the therapeutic role of music was something current and established beyond theoretical claims. And above all, that turning to music to cure certain illnesses, especially psychic conditions, may have been more widespread than we may think. And then also common to both letters, there is the idea that negative passions can be a danger, not just to individual health, but also to the moral and social cohesion of a community. And so I explore how the notion of music as therapy intersects with the government's concern about individual and collective well-being and with their idea of the state. And what emerges here is that in their view, health is not just absence of illness, but a condition of physical and especially mental well-being. It's a state of contentment that is essential to the harmony of the socio-political body. And music is crucial for achieving and maintaining this condition, or to restoring it if necessary. And so this is what's most striking here. And I'm not aware of any other example as far as medieval Italy is concerned in which music plays such a prominent role in matters of civic welfare. And I'm going to conclude with a few words on music and performance practice. All the references in the letters point to the practice of solo singing of poetry, which was widespread in Italy in this period and later. And these documents are remarkable because they give us new and significant details about this performative tradition. for example, about new contexts and spaces of performance, or about unorthodox figures of musicians, such as the itinerant healer. And it's also interesting to compare the terminology that the officials use in the letters with other sources. For example, documents like these, or treatises on metrics or music theory, chronicles or other narrative. And this helps to make some suggestions about the forms of music and poetry that the two musicians would have performed. For example, short poems, or maybe longer and strophic songs, some of them with more content, which would have been considered more appropriate to a therapeutic context. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata, for your contextual reading of these Bolognese chancery documents, which really do give us a glimpse how theory and practice intersected in late medieval Bologna, and also give us a little bit of hope for healing through music. So thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for their excellent previews of their papers just published in the Speculum January issue. Now I want to turn things over to you, our invisible audience, but I think you're making yourselves known through the Q&A. So if you haven't already done so, why don't you begin to submit your questions? And I've already seen some of them, so I will be moderating the Q&A. So let me bring this up and we'll start at the beginning. And the first questions that came in were for Michael McCormick. So let me try to put two of them together at once. And Mike, so we have one, let's see, I'm gonna put these two questions from Ann Leader and James Morey together. Does the definition of a mass grave as 5+ persons include a time range? That's one. And second, how can mass graves or any burial be dated with any precision within a decade, for example?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Yeah, my Zoom's acting up a little bit. Let me just get a full screen here. Good. So I have proposed, and it has been generally accepted in the field, that we define as mass graves burials involving 5 or more individuals who are buried simultaneously. The dating of the individuals of the moment of burial is exceedingly challenging, which is why in the first preliminary inventory of mass graves from late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, I set the broad chronological boundaries of 300 to 800. Most dating is done on archaeological basis, that is to say, on the objects that are interred with the people. People were buried very often clothed, and one can date various aspects of their clothing for metalwork, buckles, or other grave goods, pottery that may have been included with them at the moment of burial. So the archaeological artifacts that accompany burial and furnished burials are the way in which graves are traditionally dated, for starters, and that can be very effective depending on the wealth of the objects that are buried with someone and with the quality of the archaeology that has been done on those types of objects. The second element is the relative position of the grave in the cemetery. It's possible to reconstruct the development of cemeteries over time and space, the use of space, and so you have an idea from that. The third element is radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating is fundamental in the case of successful extraction of ancient DNA of Yersinia pestis. We always do radiocarbon dating, and that gives us some idea of the certainty of the dating. Of course, radiocarbon is not precise, and particularly for the 6th century, there is, as is known to radiocarbon specialists, something called a plateau, a period in which all the dates kind of give the same result between 500 and 560-ish. So that's how scholars have proceeded until now. I have advocated, and I believe this will come to pass, a new method which combines the archaeological, the radiocarbon dating, and the advanced phylogenetic analysis of the genomes of the individuals who died tragically of this disease. If we can identify, as I have proposed, particular genomic stages in the evolution of the bacterium with particular outbreaks, and we can date those outbreaks from written and archaeological sources, then we stand on the verge of a new era in high resolution dating of archaeological burials from this period, as indeed from the Black Death pandemic as well. Does that address your questions?
I don't think we know that yet, Mike. So we may have to come back to you if and when we get a response.
Okay.
So I will move on to the, let's see, let's continue the discussion of plague, but this time the bubonic plague of the second plague pandemic. And we've got a question for Dr. Barker from Abdel Fattah Adel. What is the basis on which we can prove that plague transmission from one place to another is related to grain transportation? So Hannah, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. So generally speaking, what we're talking about, since we're talking about commensal rodents, right, black rats and mice, they live near human populations and they eat human food. So that means that we tend to find them in food storage areas or waste areas, right? Rats and mice and other kinds of commensal rodents, they live in garbage dumps. They also live in warehouses, and grain storage areas are certainly a great place for them to live. They have plenty of access to food. So the idea is that when large quantities of grain are being moved, then the rodents who are sort of living in and near the grain and eating it might be moved too, either unintentionally or they may be following the grain as their food is being, taken off a wagon and put on a ship. They might move as well. So specifically, how do we know that this happens? The best evidence is from the 20th century. One of the last plague outbreaks to occur in Britain, in Ipswich, in about 1910, was traced to a wheat shipment coming into Ipswich with rats traveling along with it. There was another case in the 1960s in Vietnam. This involved rice shipment, but there was plague transmitted in connection with this shipment through the rodents that were traveling with it. So those are the cases that are probably the best documented in a modern medical sense. But then there's been a lot of discussion about, if this seems to be a pattern, what does it mean for the past, right? So Michael McCormick has written an article about rats, grain trade, and plague transmission in the context of the first pandemic outbreak. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the plague transmission in grain trade in Northern Europe in the context of the Black Death. All the citations for this are in my article, so I'm not going to go through them right now. But this is definitely something that people have been talking about in modern and medieval and ancient plague transmission context. And I think we should be talking about it in the Mediterranean as well, if we're going to talk about it in all these other areas.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, just in an effort to make sure that, that we direct our questions toward everyone on the panel, I want to go to a question for Shannon Gayk from Carol Blessing. Is there any record of medieval sermons on the apocalypse that ties to the stained glass windows and those 15 steps? Is this generally how the book of Revelation is interpreted, or is this unique?
Okay, so that's a great question, and it's actually something that the article does go into more detail about. So first of all, the window, one thing I didn't really mention was that alongside the images of the window, there are short titles in the vernacular in Middle English that seem to be from a contemporary poem, The Prick of Conscience, which I also mentioned in the talk. So, so we don't have a sermon that directly ties to that window, but we do have a vernacular poem that does, and that's striking. And that's actually what most of the scholarship on the window thus far has been really interested in, the relationship between the window and this particular poem, because we don't have a lot of stained glass windows with vernacular inscriptions in England from this time period. And I saw that Jim Morey was asking questions here. I know he is working on precisely this problem of sort of can we reconstruct these inscriptions on this window. When it comes to vernacular sermons, the 15 signs almost always appear in sermons for the second Sunday in Advent. So, which are reflections on the second coming of Christ. So they're situated in that framework, and they seem to be drawing primarily from the Golden Legend at that point. And again, I go into a lot more detail in the article about this. One thing I would want to emphasize, though, is that this tradition is very distinct from the Johannine apocalypse. So whereas you have the book of Revelation, the apocalypse in the Bible, that does include a number of catastrophes of the end times, including plague or pestilence, the 15 signs is something really quite different entirely. It might draw a little bit from that tradition, but its modes, the catastrophes it represents, are its own thing in some ways. So it's not that the book of Revelation was interpreted in the way that we have the 15 signs here, but we have two separate streams, sort of two separate, maybe slightly intersecting traditions. And again, I do talk a little bit more about that in the article as well.
Okay. Let's see, we have a few questions here for Renata, but I saw one from Laura Smaller, who is on the editorial board of Speculum. And she's asking, how is the medical analysis of the role of music in counteracting negative passions related to the idea of incantations, such as Pietro da Bano or Roger Bacon describes them? That is, hold on one second. My chain just moved. And so I lost the question here. There it is. That is the idea that words can have effects at a distance. So Renata, did you get that?
Yeah, sorry, because I was fiddling with my microphone. And I think I missed the first words. It sounded like a difficult question.
Sure. So how is the medical analysis of the role of music related to the idea of incantations, such as Pietro da Bano and Roger Bacon described them? That is the idea that words can have effects at a distance.
Oh, right, I see. I have not encountered that particular aspect of medical, and not just medical, but also theological and philosophical thought in in the medical writings that I looked at. But it's certainly, it would be, I think, interesting to see. I think that this is a general question of how speech has a powerful effect on the mind, and not necessarily through any spiritual or demonic intervention. But I'm afraid I haven't had a chance, because I haven't encountered it in the writings I looked at for this particular for these two particular documents. But it's certainly interesting to think about it.
Well, let me give you something else to think about. That is a question from Valerie Rice. that is, you mentioned treatises on melancholy. Can she name some in the period she is discussing? Because I rather thought Ficino's was one of the first.
Yes, well, Ficino is probably one of the most studied, but treatises on melancholy or that mention music as a possible treatment of melancholic disease and the effects of melancholy appear in earlier writings. And I'm thinking of, well, back in the, I'm thinking already in the 13th century, in Latin translations made, especially the one made by Constantine the African in the 11th century. The Latin translation of an Arabic texts, because in Arabic texts on medicine and also music, the problem of melancholy and how to treat it through music is very sophisticated and treated at length. Not as much in European later writings, but the earliest mention of that is in Constantine the African. So, and later on, I'm thinking, and I think I mentioned one such as example in the article. We have a concilium, one of the concilia written by Taddeo Alderotti, and we are talking about early, late 13th century, 14th century. A concilium written for Obizzo d'Este, who was suffering from melancholy. And he, among the many things that he suggested, there was the listening to music and songs was one of the activities that was suggested in order to soothe the effects of melancholy. So Ficino is probably the best known, but there are previous examples.
Thank you. Let's give a question to Daniel. And this is a question from Dorothy Africa. Any evidence on sex differences in age of children at death?
Yeah, that's a good point to address. Actually, I didn't mention that in the short talk. Children do appear in the source in the Glockengraaf register, but I'm not convinced, or I know that they are not appearing systematically. So they appear randomly, but not systematically recorded like adults. So basically, what I've done is just chuck them out of the data set. And so accordingly, also, I don't really have anything on the division by sex for children in terms of mortality, because they're not systematically recorded. And also, you don't they don't record children by the name. It's usually just a child of such and such a person. So there would be no way to find out sex anyway. But yeah, this is also a general problem with pre-industrial demography. We often don't have age disaggregated mortality information. Even if you look to the famous early modern burial registers, there are no ages. And it's often very difficult to distinguish between who is adult and who is child. So I have a database of 500 localities, 2 million burials for the 17th century. And only 10% of that database can I make a distinction between, in a more systematic way, between adult and child. So that's the problem. We don't often have age disaggregated information on mortality for the pre-modern period. I guess that is why many historical demographers tend to work on the 19th and 20th centuries, when they have all the fancy censuses and so on.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, we'll round back to Michael McCormick. And this is a question from Russell O'Regan. All right, with the cluster of 4 identified cases in southern Cambridgeshire, should we be looking to hubs involved in trade between the Eastern and Central Mediterranean and Atlantic Europe, such as Tintagel in Cornwall and Vigo in Galicia, based on the pottery? For clusters of cases associated with the earliest known genome? And might Edix Hill indicate that the trading network, circa 400 to 700 AD, was more extensive and actually involved the North Sea? Got that,
thank
Mike?
you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to show the map again so that people can see where Edix Hill is. Is that working?
No, not yet. There it is. Mhm.
Okay, you can see Edix Hill up there on the left. Thank you for that question. So it was totally stunning to have it come from Edix Hill. We know from the from Eastern Britain, remember this is the time of the Anglo-Saxon settlement. The Romano-Celts are retreating toward the west, toward Wales and Cornwall, and the Anglo-Saxons are coming in from the east. There's a ethnogenesis going on. It's very complicated. We don't know what's happening very much, but up until now, the archaeology has suggested that Western Britain, the Western British Isles, were in commercial contact with the Mediterranean, thanks to the ceramics produced in Africa, Roman Africa, and in Asia Minor, that were transported to places like the site at Tintagel, which has been associated with the mythical King Arthur, for example. And the evidence for intense connections of Eastern Britain with the Mediterranean economy are much, much, much scarcer. So it was a big surprise to find the first robust evidence of the pandemic in Eastern Britain, in an Anglo-Saxon cemetery of a small village. Of the excavators have estimated it was about 50 people was the population that supplied this cemetery. And so the answer is yes. This is a first indication of totally unexpected economic links between this area of Britain in the first half of the 6th century and the Mediterranean, suggesting higher levels of connectivity, at least pre-plague, than we have anticipated before. It is not impossible at all that a ship might have sailed via Vigo in Galicia toward on the coast of Iberia toward the British Isles. There's certainly reason to see that in the archaeological evidence for Western Britain, but it is quite stunning to see it now in the East. So we're going to have to go back and look and see how this evidence might align with the appraisal of the archaeology of contact with the Mediterranean. The other thing to take into account, it is conceivable that this came very quickly from the Mediterranean through Gaul. So it's possible that the contagion reflects a secondary passage through Gaul, but that will only become clear as more genomes are identified and the actual geographic and chronological patterns of the spread of this terrible disease are made clear. Good, excellent question.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'd like to get to maybe a question that's directed at all of you. So if you would like to answer maybe in turn in the order in which you all spoke. From Peter Frankopan, wonderful event. Thank you to all the speakers. There is a small but vocal group of scholars who are dismissive about mortality rates and other impacts of the Justinianic plague, and also more recently of the Black Death. Might all the speakers give their view on the wider state of this debate? Thank you. So those of you who would like to speak about that, you're very welcome. I'm sure probably Mike can start us off with the debate about the Justinianic plague. Would you like to start, Mike?
Sure. So ideas about the significance of the Justinianic plague and then the pandemic that it initiated have changed over time. It was conventional wisdom when I was in graduate school that this was not a significant event, that it may have happened, but it didn't last long. And that began to change in the late 60s with the work of Biraben and Jacques Le Goff, who published a pioneering study which built also largely on Gregory of Tours, on the evidence for the first pandemic, focused largely on the Latin sources of the West. Since then, the debate has come and gone. It seems to me that the general consensus has been increasing in the direction of the significance of the impact of this phenomenon in terms of mortality and economics. But it's important to remember that it's only since 2013 that we actually know what the pathogen is, and that makes a real difference, because when we know the pathogen, we have insight into the epidemiology of its effects, its mortality, and how it's transmitted, and when it's transmitted and when it's not transmitted. So since 2013, the studies have begun to accelerate. There are some who are skeptical. That's fair enough. The evidence is, as I've stated, and as many of us will agree, is very, very rich, but very, very uneven. It's densest for the first outbreak in 541, 542. It's densest, small surprise, in the capital of the Roman Empire, where we have 2 eyewitnesses who are in direct contact with the imperial court and who experience this and give us their descriptions of what they experienced in the language of their time and culture. But it is important also to note that there are many areas about which we know nothing. And many scholars, my good friend and colleague, Bernie Bachrach, was skeptical long ago about the impact of plague at Gregory of Tours. He accepts the testimony of Gregory about where it happened, but felt that there are so many places where he doesn't describe plague that the silence is probably indicative of a lesser impact. So I would say we're at the beginning, and the approach forward must be archaeological to identify potential sites connected with the pandemic, in order to identify possible victims, in order to identify actual cases of the DNA of the pathogen, which indubitably killed the people who are in the graves. I mean, they may have been murdered once they had plague, but I think that's probably the exception. And to step by step reconstruct the spread and the intensity of the impact of this very heavy mortality. Our present pandemic, what do we have? What is it, 2 to 10% mortality? The mortality for bubonic plague runs without antibiotics, runs between 40 and 60% of cases, and in fatality. So I'm sure that we're going to discover places where the plague came once and didn't come back. Some of the eyewitnesses suggest so, and I'm sure we'll find places where it came back repeatedly, as already some of the ancient DNA and the written text suggest. So we need now to continue this ongoing discovery through the archaeology, through the archaeogenetics, and especially by going back to the very, very rich written sources, even if they're uneven, analyzing them carefully and closely, and above all, multiplying the number of written sources. My friend Dionysios Stathopoulos published an excellent first survey of the written evidence for the pandemic in 2004. Kyle Harper added some to that. There are many, many, many sources out there that have never been identified or analyzed in this context, written sources, and we're going to need to look at them as well. And over time, we'll come to a new understanding of this extraordinary phenomenon and be able to see the limitations, and in places the very extreme impact that it, in my opinion, likely had. So I expect to see an increasingly substantial, increasingly complicated, and an increasingly diverse picture of the unfolding of this pandemic over a 200-year period, over 3 continents.
Thanks, Mike. I know Hannah has something to say on the question as well, so let's hear from her.
So I'll just add to what Michael was saying, that I think archaeology is the way forward for the Black Death outbreak as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about this discussion outside the European context. So there's, for example, among Africanists, archaeologists of Africa, we're just at the very beginning of a really interesting discussion about whether there might be archaeological evidence of the Black Death in West Africa, right? But this is really something that's going to have to be studied through the archaeology and through the ancient DNA, and then going back and looking at the written texts and trying to put it together into a more complete picture. My sense of the scholarship on the Golden Horde, the one who comes to mind right away is Uli Şamiloglu, is that it was devastating. There doesn't seem to be a lot of debate there. The problem, of course, is numbers, right? And again, this is someplace where having archaeological investigation would be really helpful. There's already been some. There was a sample of Yersinia pestis DNA that was found at Leshchevo, which is kind of opening the discussion of what was going on in the Golden Horde, and having more material from Southern Russia would be great to build up this picture a little bit more. The main thing I wanted to mention, though, is the Mamluks. We actually have really good textual evidence of the mortality rates in big Mamluk cities, and especially Cairo. The person who's done the most work on this has been Stuart Borsch, I think. But essentially what happened is the officials in the city of Cairo were very interested in the mortality rate, and they wanted counts of the number of people that were dying. So they supervised the number of bodies that were either prayed over. There were sort of certain oratories in certain locations where people would bring the bodies of people who had died of plague. So they looked at how many bodies were passing through the oratories each day, and or how many bodies were passing through the city gates each day to be buried outside the city, because bodies were supposed to be buried within a day of when they had died. And then they would consult with each other. So the scribes who were positioned at different gates would consult and compile their numbers to have numbers for the entire city. So Stuart Borsch has done the work of sort of tracing these numbers in different sources. Some of them report the oratory numbers or the gate numbers. Some of them report the total city numbers, but they're quite detailed. They're not estimates, right? And they add up pretty well from the gates and the oratories to the city. So then you can get into a discussion of how do we estimate the total population of Cairo, and out of the total population, how many are dying. But I think in terms of statistics, that's actually a really interesting and very helpful case.
Thanks, Hannah. Let us move on to a question that probably can be posed to most of you, or those of you who are reading some of the narrative sources. This is from Jean Lyman. Professor McCormick mentioned that the works of Gregory of Tours were largely focused on highlighting God's punishment of sinners. This is a common theme in explanations of visitations of the Black Death in the 14th and 15th century. Langland, for example, has reason preached this message in one of the early passos of Piers Plowman. Do we have any evidence of a questioning of the justice of such visitations surviving in documents associated with plague narratives or sermons from the period? One thinks of Job's complaint. So I think that, there are a number of you who could field this particular question. So let me know who'd like to take it first.
I can offer an initial thought while others gather the
Sure.
thoughts. Indeed, this is a very well posed question and an important aspect of the reaction to this phenomenon. For me, working on the Justinianic pandemic, the testimony of Evagrius, a church historian, lawyer of the Patriarch of Antioch, writing in Greek in the second half of the 6th century, provides a bit of an autobiographical statement about the various waves of plague that affected him and in particular his family, his household in the course of his life. And if memory serves, he has a particularly moving statement that refers to the death of his daughter. And if you read a bit between the lines, it sounds like this is a really, really profound problem for this man. How can God do such a thing? And in fact, there is a contemporary hagiographical text, the life of Simeon the Stylite, one of these fellows who lives on columns, the younger, which refers to a contact with Evagrius, in which, if you read rather carefully, it suggests that Evagrius lost his faith, and that one of the miracles that Simeon performed was to restore his faith despite the tragedy that he had experienced. So these are straws in the wind. Most of our documents, as Professor Lyman will know, do not come from the lay people. They come from the church, and one can find in cases such as Evagrius, such as those that you cite from the late Middle Ages, and I believe also elsewhere in the first pandemic of plague, the Justinianic pandemic, similar echoes or hints of the challenge that this posed to the teachings of the church and the understanding of the righteousness of God.
Thank you, Mike. And it looks like Shannon would like to speak to this question as well. So why don't we have Shannon? And then there's a related question that's posed particularly to Hannah, but I think anybody could also address this question. So Shannon, please.
Yeah, so since you mentioned Piers Plowman, I can weigh in here. I actually talk about that particular moment in my article where the figure of reason preaches a sermon that says the pestilence and this catastrophic wind that knocks over all these trees. This is a now well-known wind from 1362 that led to a tidal surge that wiped out a lot of low-lying cities. He says these things are due to pride. And so we have an example of the punishment paradigm there that is, I think, a really dominant model of how people in the late Middle Ages thought about catastrophe, about plague, about environmental catastrophe as well. But I think when you start looking, I'm a literary critic after all, so I think when you start looking into a lot of the narrative literary sources, especially that represent plague and other types of catastrophes, you see a more subtle form of resistance, just like Dr. McCormick was talking about. These, you see these hints. So, for example, in a number of representations of floods, of Noah's flood, for example, instead of saying this is judgment, they'll often say, well, focus attention again, just like I was saying in my paper, on the suffering bodies, really invite people to pay attention to that. And that might be to produce fear and a sense of retribution or judgment. But it also, I think, can solicit empathy as well. Again, they almost never explicitly come out and question the justice of these causes. Some people do turn toward more scientific explanations and talk about the causation. But I do think if we start looking into how text function much more closely, we see these small moments of resistance to these larger models.
Thanks, Shannon. And Hannah, this is a related question to you from Suhail Ahmad. Could you highlight approaches of the medieval churches in dealing with the plagues? Do we find any example in literature in which we can point that people had lost faith in the healing power of the religion and had started practicing unusual things to cure themselves?
Yeah, so I'll say for some of the other panelists may want to weigh in on this, because my area of expertise is more about how the plague arrived and less about what happened next, right? But that being said, when I'm teaching this, I like to have my students read sort of an array of responses of people who are encountering plague for the first time, right? And how do they think about it? How do they respond? And there's the religious responses you've highlighted, that this is an act of God, maybe it's a punishment, maybe it's a test. You know, there are different ways that people think about that. And so then the response should be a religious one. You should pray. There are these penitential processions, things like that. there's an astrological response, right? That disease is caused by the movement of the stars. And so they're trying to figure out, what is in conjunction with what that's causing this disease. And this is actually something I've seen happen now in 2020, which is really interesting, right? So then, what are the appropriate responses to that? And then, there is medieval medicine, right? And it operates according to a different intellectual framework than what we're used to, but there are medical discussions about, this is contagion, it spreads, it's a miasma, it has to do with pollution or of the air or the water, and this is what's causing pollution of bodies and throwing their humors out of balance. So if this is an issue of humoral imbalance and pollution, then there needs to be some kind of a humoral solution. So the medical responses tend to be about hygiene, right? About keeping the air clean and free of smells of various kinds. When I was quoting that description of the siege of Kappa, they talked about the stench of the dead bodies. It's that kind of idea. There are responses that involve the water, trying to keep the water clean. Regulation of butchers, right? Because you have the bad smells that come out of butchers. So just broadly speaking, I would say there's this range of responses, immediate responses to the arrival of the plague, and they're not all religious. Religion is one component. And you can find individuals mentioning all three of these things. They're not mutually exclusive either. But what happens over the course of time, I think I might leave that to other panelists, since the long evolution of this I haven't looked into as much.
If I may, I would just point out that I did encounter such a case in the article that we've been talking about today. Gregory of Tours reports hundreds, perhaps thousands of miraculous cures of illnesses in his works. And I find it rather extraordinary, something people have not noticed, that he reports only one cure of plague. And that occurs in his own household, and it occurs after, behind his back, one of his slaves comes down with plague, and the other people of the household call in a traditional healer who work this person over with incantations and strings and so forth. And of course, he dies. Gregory is furious when he finds out. Another slave comes down with plague. Gregory goes to the tomb of the saint, gets the dust, brings it back, makes him drink it, and miraculously he is cured. That's the only cure of bubonic plague that I have found in the works of Gregory. And I suspect that he veritably thunders when he describes how naturally this man was going to die because he turned to these pagan superstitions to try to save him. I think that there's more of a story back there that he's not telling us.
Thank you. I think we're going to go back to the healing power of music for a moment, speaking of healing. And this is a question, of course, for Renata, thanking you for this presentation with revealing evidence about the activity of traveling cantastorie in civic healing programs. Were such performers, however, already associated in the Trecento with charlatanism, as they were famously in the Cinquecento and Seicento, the famous mountebanks of Venice and many other Italian cities?
Yeah, this is interesting, and I talk a little bit about this in the article, because the figure of the itinerant healer and expert in herbs and remedies against poison and a performer of songs is obviously very easily, it can be very easily compared to those figures. The problem is that the officials of the commune speak about him in very in high terms. They really praise him, and their attitude is different from what I've seen regarding the attitude of officials of town officials or other authorities towards charlatans in later periods, because in the 16th and 17th century, charlatans and mountebanks, people who would mix their musical and performance skills with other tricks to make people buy their medicines were not really praised, or that we didn't have a great reputation in urban context, although they really marked the soundscape of medieval of Renaissance Italy. Sorry. So I have difficulties in comparing the example I found, this itinerant healer, with those figures, or in general with Trecento charlatans. I think part of the problem is also that we have less documentary evidence about the Trecento charlatans. So we have a lot more documentary evidence about a later period. Another category, of course, is the civic canterini, of which I also talk in the article. But those canterini have a slightly different, they're slightly different than charlatans. They overlap in some sense, but they're not entirely comparable. And there are, for example, the cantarini of the signoria, the singers who would entertain the signori, the authorities at dinner, for example, and singing moral songs for them. Those are more, I think, comparable to the itinerant healer that I found in my document.
And let me just add another question here from Jenna Phillips. Do these new documents from Bologna provide any information about the type of music or the performance of music in the homes of the sick or grieving citizens? For example, do we know if it was secular, vernacular songs, or is there an indication of sacred music or prayers for healing? In Renaissance Italy, motets and other songs were composed devoted to Saint Sebastian, known for his miraculous healing of plague victims. Is there any information about genre, use of instruments, etc.?
Okay, well, I wish there were more details in the letters about what type of music may have been performed in the context I'm talking about. The letters, the terminology is vague. It is comparable to other sources, also to medical writings. When they mention music, they normally mention, the letters mention soni, sonetti, and cantilene. And I make some hypotheses on the basis of comparison with other similar sources. And my idea is that it's mostly vernacular music because they speak about poems in the vernacular. And soni may indicate, especially in opposition to cantilene, may just simply point to short poems that were set to music specifically for specific occasions, so not written down, but improvised or composed on that particular occasion. But they are monostrophic, probably, and whereas cantilene are possibly longer strophic songs with sometimes pre-existent material, melodic material that could be used. There's not much else in terms of the character or the register of the music that could have been performed on these occasions. Obviously, if we look at the brief and vague mentions in medical writing or other texts, we may imagine that slower music may have been used to calm down or to soothe certain negative passions such as anger or other effects of other similar passions, or quicker rhythms may have been used to cure melancholy, but it's all very vague, and we wish we could tell more about this. And I don't know about whether these texts may have had a religious content. One of the letters mentions moral songs, so cantilene morali. So that's an important indication.
Finally, we have a comment from Chris Kleinhans, really about the music and healing. And he's saying that in response to Renata's comment about music and civic welfare, I would note that Dante in the Inferno connects certain discordant musical references with civic unrest, Master Adam, Canto 30, and the Malebranche, Canto 21. And by contrast, harmonious music would suggest civic harmony.
All right, yes. Yes.
All right, so I think we're going to end on the note of musical healing and take it to heart. But I am so grateful to our presenters and their stimulating presentations and discussion. We have arrived at a couple of minutes before 2, as you know. And so I want to ask all of you in the in our invisible audience to thank our panelists as well. And I also want to say that just in case you had to run out in the middle of this presentation, such as you know, having to take care of your kids or teach a class or whatever you have to do in this pandemic world, this entire session with the permission of the panelists has been taped, and it will be posted to the Medieval Academy of America website sometime next week, and that's themedievalacademy.org. So sometime next week, you'll be able to catch up on the bits that you had to miss. So in closing, I will just say until next time, because I think there will be a next time. Stay well, stay safe, and Vale. Thank you all.